everyone, and welcome to the first of your 4 feedback videos on the March mock exam. So the social influence section was the first section, so let's get going straight off. Outline and explain the findings of Milgram's investigation into the effect of location on obedience. So I just want to draw your attention to a couple of quick things before we actually look at a sample answer. Firstly, the question asks you to do 2 separate things, outline and explain. So outline is to give the findings. Explain, I have to say, was the weaker part of this question. So you had to explain it in relation to legitimacy of authority. I do just want to point out to you as well that the question asked you to talk specifically about the change in location for this variation. Simply saying Bridgeport was insufficient, you had to actually change, or say rather, what the change was. So it was a change of venue to a rundown building. In order to achieve a level 2 response, so to achieve 3 or 4 marks on this question, it was your explanation that had to be sufficient. So there had to be good reference to legitimacy of authority. So let's just take a look at what the findings actually were here. You needed to say that in the Bridgeport variation, or the location variation, obedience fell from 65% down to 47.5/48%, okay? Either of those 2 figures are acceptable. What's not acceptable to say is that it fell by 47 or 48%, because that's simply not accurate. So you had to be using those 2 words there, from 65 to 47, 48%. So double check your answer now. Did you make that error? I've already said that in order to get into level 2, it was your explanation that had to be detailed. So the question is asking you to talk about legitimacy of authority. So you needed to say that in a change of location in a rundown office, there was a lack of legitimate authority. And then possibly expand it with some reference to the fact that you may question the knowledge of the researcher, you may question the authority of the researcher, you may see them as lower status, for example. So there had to be some sort of explanation as to why location had an effect on obedience in the context of legitimacy of authority. So let's pull up a sample answer, and you can see that this one did get 4. It only just got 4 though, and you'll see why if we break it down. So the location of the experiment was moved from Yale University to Bridgeport. So initially they've got the identification, but there's no expansion. It does reference it later on, thankfully, but initially it just says Bridgeport. So when the location was moved, we've got the use of the correct terms here. So it was a drop from 65% to 48%. Now, the reason why this one got full credit is because there's immediate reference to a lack of legitimacy of authority. And they expand it by saying that their actions during the experiment may not have received kind of any punishment or less punishment for the disobedience. So they were trying to contextualise it. They also have this little reference at the end to the fact that it was done in a rundown office block creates less pressure on the participants to be obedient. So there's just enough there to warrant a level 2, maximum level 2 response on this question, a 4 out of 4. You can go ahead and add now anything that you think was missing in your answer. So moving on to question 2. On social influence, you had to evaluate the methodology of Milgram's research into obedience, but you weren't permitted to talk about ethics for this question. Now, I do just want to clarify that those students who achieved, again, level 2 responses were typically the students who did 2 separate points here. I did give a couple of people who had done 1 point but really kind of expanded it thoroughly. I did give them 4, but not many people were able to stretch out 1 evaluation point to that point really to receive full credit. So the people who did the best here here were people who either did two entirely separate evaluation points, or they offered an evaluation point with a contradictory argument on the end. And if you recall your social influence booklet, that's kind of how it's formatted. And this is the technique that we would really like you to use going forward, that you put forward a criticism, okay, and then you counter argument with opposing arguments. So for example, this one that I've put up here, you may well say that Milgram's study was low in ecological validity and or mundane realism, but then you could flesh out that point and achieve 4 by counter arguing it with the Bickman study. The obedience was shown in similar ways in actually a real life situation. So that was the best way to fulfill the 4 marks on this question. I am just going to draw your attention to some other things, all right, that are important in this question. Your point had to include reference to a specific aspect or aspects, if it was more than one point, of Milgram's research and what that does to his findings about obedience. The vast majority of answers that got a 4 out of 4 were really well contextualised. They were very applied, and they also had very good conclusions about what that does to Milgram's theory. If you are looking at your answer and you've only got maybe 2 out of 4, then it's likely that your points were quite generic, so not well applied, not heavily referencing Milgram's study, essentially. So very minimal credit because you've got a lack of application to Milgram. Now, a quick tip here, that reliability and mundane realism are really, really easy points to do and pick up the marks for to get the application points, because all you have to do if you're doing reliability is talk about the standardised prods, and if you're doing mundane realism, talk about the artificial electric shock. It's a really easy route to those application marks, so that's just something to bear in mind. Also, if you wanted to go down that route that I just said a couple of moments ago, where you're offering a counter argument, then sample bias and mundane realism are the easiest options to offer that counter. So we've already seen with the Bickman study that can be offered as a counter argument for mundane realism. With the sample bias, you can say that the findings have been replicated globally with females and the same findings have been shown. So that's a couple of quick tips for you there if you want to build in those counter arguments, that's a good way of doing it. So if I just pull up a sample answer here, now this student actually chose to go with internal validity. There's a slight overlap with what they've said in terms of standardised prods. A lot of you use that for reliability. This person's opted to use it as part of her internal validity point. So let's just have a look. The research was high in internal validity. This is because it involves standardised procedures of administering an electric shock up to 450 volts, and participants were given the same cues such as please continue. Now here's where they make it relevant to internal validity. There was tight manipulation of variables such as the confederate always being the learner and the same outfit for the researcher. This increases the validity that situational factors cause obedience. Now notice that conclusion in there puts it in the context of Milgram's theory. Check your answer, did you do that? That's one of the reasons why this response got 4 out of 4. They've then combated that strength with a disadvantage by saying that it lacks mundane realism, and then we've got the application as well, again to Milgram, by talking about the task of the electric shock. So the first point in itself was sufficient to get into level 3, but they've got a counter argument, level 2, 3 marks, but they've got a counter argument on the end as well. Okay, so that's how potentially you could achieve 4 out of 4. Moving on to the next question. We had to write a consent form. Now, the consent form should have been an easy opportunity for the vast majority of you to get kind of 3 or 4 marks, but let's just have a breakdown really of what you should be including in a consent form. So I'm just going to refer you back to the booklet, So this was in booklet 3, research methods. When you write in a consent form, it's used to inform participants of the aims and objectives of the research and should include 2 aspects. It should include enough information which would influence a participant's willingness to take part, and also a checklist of ethical guidelines that the participants can either tick off or can indicate their willingness to consent and to take part. So it gives you a little idea of some of the things that you may well be referring to. So length of time, task details, opportunity to contact the researcher, all of those ethical issues being addressed, an opportunity to ask questions or seek clarification, and then there's got to be a space for them to offer their consent, typically a signing space, okay? So this is what we would expect you to be including in any consent form. So if we just have a look at the mark scheme, that was our booklet, but what does the mark scheme actually say? For level 2 answers, there needed to be specific details of that research included. So for example, you may have referred to the fact that it was groups of 4 being tested and it was a study about their attitudes to school homework policies, but there had to be something in there. Also, to get into level 2, there needed to be ethical details, not exclusive to, but possibly including right to ask questions, withdrawing data, maintaining confidentiality. I also want to just draw your attention to the fact that if you didn't give them a place to consent, you would actually get 1 mark, because this is a consent form. So even if you'd given them all of those details, if they have got no place to actually consent, you've not done what the question is asking. Now, top tip, please don't scrimp on a consent form. Some of you produce really short consent forms, and I'm always baffled by why you would do that, because this is literally like the easiest format that you could ever get given on research methods. So don't scrimp on it, just ensure that you've got enough detail from the study and enough ethical issues, and most of the time you would get 4, if not 3, okay? But as long as you're being coherent in what you are saying, which did knock a couple of your marks down, as long as you're being coherent, it's easy money, okay? So let's just have a look at one that did achieve 4. So, dear student, through this form you are agreeing to be interviewed, so we've got first detail, in the presence of 3 other students, second detail, and a teacher regarding the attitudes to homework policies. So we've got all those details there. You have the right to withdraw from the interview at any time, so it's nice and contextualised. Your information will not be used. Following the interview, there will be a debrief which will answer any questions you have, whilst explaining how your information will be used. So that's a follow-up. You can contact the teacher at any time before or after the interview regarding your concerns through the email below. Sign here if you consent to taking part in the interview. So this one chose unusual ethical options in the sense that referring to debrief and contact after, but it's all legitimate ethical concerns that are raised, including the detail from the study, okay? So we've got all of that lovely detail and we've got a place to consent, which is absolutely crucial, okay? So go ahead now and add on whatever you feel that you were missing. Maybe you've included everything, but it was just the answer wasn't quite clear enough. It didn't have enough coherency, perhaps. Okay, moving on to question 4. In my opinion, this was probably the poorest answered question on the mock. It was really tricky, this one. So explain how using stratified sampling might improve the design of this study for 2 marks. And again, I want to just draw you back to what it actually says in your booklet for stratified sample. This involves identifying groups called strata that exist in the target population, for example, males or females, or age groups, which is what we were dealing with in this study, and calculating proportions of individuals which you need from each of those stratas or subgroups to represent the overall target population. So we've got a lot of key terms in there. You're identifying subgroups called stratas. You are working out then how many people you need to represent those proportions, those subgroups, and in doing so you will have a sample which represents your target population, okay, proportionally. So it was a really, really difficult question, this one. Have a look at your answer now. How many of those key concepts did you actually include? All right. So let's go back now to the mark scheme. It was a how question, and it had to be in the context of how stratified sampling would improve the design. And as I've already said, very few people were awarded 2 marks. In fact, I would say the majority didn't get any marks at all. There were also a large volume of students who just didn't answer this, okay? So if you've got 1, it may well be that you've tried to say something from the mark scheme that's on the right lines, but maybe it wasn't quite clear enough. So stratified sample could ensure that various groups are represented in terms of their proportionality in the population, and this would improve the generalisability of the results. So there had to be reference in your answer to proportions, essentially, okay? Most answers that got 2 out of 2, there was reference to the fact that groups are represented in their proportions. You're saying that it's the proportions that then increase the generalisability or make the sample itself more representative. Now, what you should also consider, okay, once you've got your proportions in there, is that you should probably have been referring to what the actual subgroups were in this study, because it does say improve the design of this study. So just read your own answer back, add on anything that I've got here, okay? Have you got reference to proportions? Have you said that it's those proportions that make it more representative or make it more generalisable? And have you actually said what the subgroups were in this study? Now, I will just say, if you're looking at your answer and you're thinking none of that makes sense for me, but I have been given credit, some students might have been given some credit for comparison to volunteer sampling, but this was in most cases in an implicit comparison rather than actually referring to any of the key ideas that I've already highlighted. So any comparison to volunteer sampling, if it was done well but it was implicit, you might have got 1 mark. So this was a 2 marker. Again, there were few and far between, but stratified would improve it by gaining a more representative sample. So we've got that key idea there, but then it's explained. So quotas will be recorded, rather, or decided, I think it says, and then randomly selected. Each proportion, it would cover the whole school and would mean that it would be generalised easier. So this individual has said that you've got quotas, then you're selecting proportions of those quotas. So quotas they've just used rather than saying stratas. It'd give you a more representative sample because it's giving you proportions of the whole school and you can generalise it. Okay, moving on then. If you want to just highlight these key ideas. Moving on. Next question. This one, pretty self-explanatory. You got 2 marks for any one of the following. However, some of you were referring to entirely separate concepts, like giving me characteristics of an authoritarian personality or the locus of control, which just implied that you maybe needed to do a bit more revision of minority influence. So on to the 8 mark question then, biggest question in this section. Outline and evaluate locus of control as an explanation of resistance. You may just want to note down that this was 3 marks of AO1, so it had to be quite condensed but coherent, and then 5 marks of AO3. So this was the possible content on the left, and you can see the levels or the mark bands as well. So just take a look at that initially. And then we are going to refer back to your booklet at this stage. So this is the content that you were provided with in your booklet. So to pull out some key concepts that you should probably have included in your answer, or you may want to add in now. You should have firstly said that locus of control is a personality trait. Thus, it is considered a dispositional explanation of resistance. You then probably needed to expand and say what locus of control actually is. So it is this idea or the extent to which the things that happen to you are a result of your own choices, your own responsibilities, or it's a person's perception of their own level of control over events that occur. So say it's dispositional, say what it actually is. You then want to expand, all right, by saying that they do, people who have this type of personality do assume responsibility and they do accept consequences. You want to also say what the characteristics of an internal locus of control actually are, okay? Now, this is from an essay that I gave to my students, but I know that you all filled in a little diagram in your booklet with this content. So these are some of the things that you could have said. They tend to be higher levels of intelligence. They have confidence in their own opinions. They therefore make good leaders. They have a strong tendency towards academia and are very achievement orientated. For that reason, they're active seekers of information and they seek to be informed and inform others. So we've got, it's a dispositional trait. It's about choices and effort and responsibility and consequences. We're saying that those who are internals are the ones that resist, and we're listing some characteristics. Now, some of you have done virtually all of that, but you haven't made the point that it is an internal locus of control that is more likely to resist social influence. Read your own answer now. Have you kind of wittered on about an internal locus of control without actually saying that that's what allows people to resist social pressures? Okay, so double check it now. Add in anything from your AO1 content that is possibly missing, okay? It did have to be quite concise, but they're the ways that you would have picked up the marks. Okay. Moving on to the AO3 points, again, just listing what was in the booklet. For 5 AO3 marks, you should be aiming to include 2 evaluation points in total. Some of you have stretched beyond that and given 3, but 2 well done was absolutely enough. Now, most answers attempted either of these studies, but few actually gave detailed enough, or accurate enough descriptions of either Holland or Olliner and Olliner to warrant kind of full credit, because you were missing what they actually showed us about resistance, i.e. weaker points weren't well concluded. So take a moment to read your own answer now and look at the conclusions listed in the booklet. Have you actually offered a conclusion? If you haven't, then your AO3 will have attracted fewer marks, okay, less credit. Furthermore, if you are evaluating a theory, you should try to aim for balance. So we're always kind of saying to you that you should really aim for a strength and a weakness. So for this reason, many talked about social desirability in the self-report by Olliner and Olliner, but it wasn't well done. So I do just want to pull up that for you as well. So again, this is an essay that I provided to my students, but it's based on the same content from the booklet, okay? So it's something that you have all got. And I want to draw your attention to this bit about socially desirable answers. So, participants in this particular piece of research, it is possible that responses provided socially desirable answers and were likely to have made claims about their willingness to protect the Jews that were invalid. Furthermore, it is possible that they exaggerated their level of social responsibility and internal characteristics as to not appear callous and aligning themselves with the Nazis. All of this being said, whilst we must be cautious when considering the methodology, it is still supporting real-life evidence to validate the dispositional theories of resistance. So notice in that description there, like I said, I'm only building it on what you already had in the booklet anyway, but there is reference to how they are being socially desirable in that particular study. And this point is concluded in relation to the theory, i.e. yes, there are methodological problems, but it is still evidence to validate the dispositional theories of resistance. So if we just now at this point, again, go back to the mark scheme, look at your overall mark, based on the content in the booklets, can you see now what was missing from your answer? And we'll finish off, obviously, just by having a look at a sample answer. I do just want to point out to you before we pull up that model answer that there should really not have been any reference to external locus of control. It's not required at all, essentially. The only way that it would ever receive credit is if you said that externals are not able to resist social influence. For most people, I wouldn't even mention it, okay? Just stick firmly to internals. So let's now have a look at that model answer. I've kind of explained all of these points to you already. So I'm just going to zoom in on her AO1 content to begin with. So locus of control is a dispositional explanation that suggests those with a higher internal locus, so we're straight away saying it's dispositional and it's internal, are more likely to resist social influence. This is because they are more independent of thoughts, they are more academic, are more information driven and rely less on other people for their thoughts and behaviour. Therefore, in the context of the question, making them more likely to resist. Those with an internal locus of control are therefore less likely to obey social influence as they have confidence in their own thoughts and beliefs regarding right and wrong. So it's all focused on resistance. You can see that she's got all those different aspects that I was referring to before. So now then into her evaluation points. The bottom is just an introduction. The bottom of that previous section is just an introduction. So there are studies into non-Jews in Germany during Nazi persecutions. The people were interviewed regarding if they helped protect or helped hide the Jews from persecution. It was found that those who helped had a high level of internal locus of control and they disobeyed and resisted the orders of the Nazis, even though it could result in death or execution due to their personality. So she's saying what the consequences would have been. Therefore, this increases the validity of the internal locus of control as it is supported by real-life evidence. So that definitely is top credit. And then we've got this methodology point. This can be limited through methodology as it is based on self-report methods. It is suggested that many of the Germans may have over-exaggerated their role in the protection of the Jews as they didn't want to appear to be aligning themselves with the Nazis. Therefore, the results can be questioned as they are often impacted by social desirability, which overemphasises the role of internal locus of control. However, even though this reduces the validity of the supporting evidence, it cannot be ignored that there is real-life evidence supporting the locus of control theory. Okay, so I've put there good because even though she's offered the criticism, it's all in the context of the fact that it is supporting evidence. So you can see based on what was in your booklet that this student has taken those concepts, kept it nicely focused on resistance, good application of the social desirability point, so that has to get right into the top, okay? So hopefully you found that useful. Maybe take a breather before your next section, but on to your next section of the mock. Thank you very much for listening.